Picture this. You're commanding 100,000 soldiers. You've got artillery, cavalry, infantry, the whole package. Your job? March into Ottoman territory. Find the enemy and win a glorious battle. Simple, right? Except you managed to lose 10,000 men without the enemy even showing up. Not to disease, not to desertion. Your boys literally fought themselves in the dark, got absolutely wrecked, and when the Ottomans finally arrived 2 days later, they just walked in, saw the carnage, and were like, we'll take it? Welcome to the Battle of Karansebes, September 1788, where the Austrian army achieved the impossible. They got their asses kicked by themselves. This isn't some urban legend. This actually happened, and it's about to get so much worse. The man, the myth, the disaster. Let's talk about our star player. Emperor Joseph II of Austria, Holy Roman Emperor, enlightened despot, and a man whose military genius was matched only by his ability to pick the absolute worst people for every job. Joseph II was that guy. You know the type. The dude who watches 300 once and suddenly thinks he's a tactical genius. He'd been getting absolutely bodied in European politics by Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick basically turned him into a geopolitical punching bag, and Joey was feeling some type of way about it. His expansion plans? Blocked. His military reputation? Trash. His ego? Bruised like a dropped peach. So naturally, when Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire in 1787 and called in Austria as an ally, Joseph saw his chance to prove he wasn't a complete military disaster. Spoiler alert, he absolutely was. This is the equivalent of forgetting your wallet on a first date, then insisting you can totally make up for it by cooking dinner at your place. Except you don't know how to cook and your apartment is on fire. That's Joseph II's military career in a nutshell. The dream team of incompetence. Now, if you're going to lead 245,000 men into battle, you'd think you want your best guys in charge, right? Your A-team, your Navy SEALs, your Special Forces. Joseph looked at all his competent commanders and said, nah. He assembled what historians would later describe as a lineup remarkable in the annals of Austrian military history for their stupidity and incompetence. And that's not me being dramatic. That's literally from the historical records. Let me introduce you to the crew. Coburg, incompetent. Fabius, incompetent. Warder-Sleben, you guessed it, incompetent. Mitrovsky, take a wild guess. Devens, the hits keep coming. The one guy who actually knew what he was doing? Field Marshal Lawton, the old badass who'd served Emperor Joseph's mom, Maria Theresa, with distinction. This dude was a legend. He'd won actual battles. He knew how logistics worked. He understood that retreat and advance were different things. Joseph looked at the 70-year-old military genius and thought, he's too old. Probably needs a nap or something. Instead, he picked Marshal Lacy, who was so old and worn out he could barely function. It's like benching LeBron James in the finals and putting in your coach's nephew who plays rec league. Joseph II had a PhD in picking the wrong person for literally every job. If there was a worst possible choice option, Joey found it, interviewed it, and gave a command of 100,000 men. The army that couldn't talk to each other. Here's where it gets even better. The Austrian army in 1788 wasn't just an army. It was a cultural jambalaya of soldiers who couldn't understand each other. You had Germans, Austrians, Czechs, French, Serbs, Croats, Italians, Poles, and Slovaks all crammed together, which sounds great for diversity, except none of them spoke the same language. Joseph himself wrote to his brother Leopold about this problem. The diversity of our troops, though a strength in numbers, has proven to be a formidable challenge in command. The men, unable to understand one another, fall into disarray at the slightest provocation. Translation, Leopold, bro, nobody knows what the hell anyone else is saying, and it's a ticking time bomb. Imagine trying to coordinate a bank heist where half your crew speaks Spanish, a quarter speaks Mandarin, another quarter speaks Russian, and your safecracker only communicates through interpretive dance. That's the Austrian army. This wasn't just a logistics problem. This was a communications nightmare that historians described as disaster was simply a matter of time. These different ethnic groups didn't just misunderstand each other. They straight up didn't trust each other. There were underlying tensions, rivalries, and the kind of side-eye that makes Thanksgiving dinner with your in-laws look like a love fest. But sure, Joey, let's march this powder keg into enemy territory. What could go wrong? The glorious campaign that immediately went sideways. Joseph kicked off his grand campaign in 1788 with 245,062 men, 36,725 horses, 898 field guns, 176,700 cannonballs, and 1,000 tons of black powder. To feed this monster on the march required 800 tons of flour and 200 beef cattle daily. The logistics alone were insane. This was the 18th century equivalent of trying to move a small city across the Balkans, while keeping everyone fed, armed, and not murdering each other. The emperor himself took personal command of 125,000 soldiers. He was going to be out there, leading from the front, showing everyone how a real military genius operates. The plan? March into Ottoman territory, find the Turkish army under Grand Vizier Koca Yusuf Pasha, deliver a crushing defeat, and cement Joseph II's place in history as a great military leader. First target, Belgrade. On May 15, 1788, everything was set. The guns were positioned, infantry ready. Belgrade's garrison was weak. This was going to be an easy W. And then, on the evening of May 15th, Emperor Joseph II suddenly changed his mind and ordered a retreat. Not because of some brilliant tactical insight, not because of new intelligence. He just decided the Russians hadn't shown up yet, so he bailed. The troops were right there. They could literally see the walls. And Joey called it off. It's like queuing up for a roller coaster for 3 hours. Getting in the front of the line, looking at the ride and going, actually, you know what? My friend isn't here yet. Let's leave. Morale tanked. Troops lost faith in their officers, and officers grumbled about their emperor. The army was pissed. Joseph had made the march all that way, prep for battle, and then just nope out. Eventually, Joseph got so desperate he had to beg old Field Marshal Lawton to take command. I do not order you, my dear Field Marshal Lawton, to take command of my troop, but I ask you humbly to do it for the best of state and the love for your emperor. Lawton didn't do it for love of Joseph. He did it to save the Austrian army from complete collapse. On July 18th, he took command, and by July 19th, he'd already conquered a fortress. See? Competent leadership works. Who knew? But Lawton couldn't be everywhere at once. His subordinate commanders kept screwing up. General Papilla got his division decimated by 13,000 Turks. Major von Stein lost a strategic position at Dubowa, forcing the Austrians to give up the entire Danube Valley back to Belgrade. By September, things were getting desperate. Intelligence reported that Grand Vizier Yusuf Pasha, Koca Yusuf Pasha, was marching with 70,000 men, while another Ottoman force of 30,000 was heading to NIS. The Austrians needed to make a stand. Joseph decided they'd dig in at a town called Karansebes along the Timis River. The genius plan. Joseph was absolutely pumped about this choice. He stood there, looked at the map, and declared, "Here we have to win. History has planned it this way." It was here that Prince Eugene achieved a brilliant victory over the Turks, and this is the best place to beat them again. This is a military strategy equivalent of saying, my team won here in 1715, so obviously we'll win here now, while completely ignoring that your team sucks, your coach is incompetent, and half your players are drunk. The Austrian army, about 100,000 strong, set up camp near Karansebes on September 20th, 1788. They knew the Ottomans were close. Scouts had confirmed it. Everyone was on edge, expecting a massive battle. Joseph was convinced this was going to be his redemption arc, his Gettysburg, his Waterloo, but, on the winning side. When things started going wrong, Joseph even sent out a plea to churches across the empire to pray for victory. O Lord, the Almighty, you smite the enemies of your goodness. Grant us your mighty protection. Spare your fighters from the dangers brought upon them by the infidels. Buddy, if you're already begging God for help before the battle starts, that's not a great sign. The stage was set. 100,000 Austrian soldiers camped along the Timis River, waiting for the Ottoman army to arrive. Tensions were high. Nobody trusted their commanders. Nobody could understand half of what anyone else was saying. Everyone was scared, tired, and ready to jump at shadows. All it would take was one tiny spark to turn this powder keg into an absolute catastrophe. And on the night of September 21st, 1788, they got that spark in the form of Schnapps. So we've got our setup. 100,000 Austrian soldiers camped near Carensiebes, waiting for the Ottoman army to show up, so they can finally win a battle and salvage Emperor Joseph II's catastrophically bad military reputation. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Literally everything. Because here's the thing about disasters. They don't just happen. They announce themselves with red flags so massive they could be seen from space. And the Austrian command looked at every single warning sign and went, "Nah, we're good." Let's talk about the absolutely chef's kiss perfect storm of incompetence that was brewing. Red flag number 1. Nobody can talk to each other and nobody cares. Remember how we established that the Austrian army was a linguistic Tower of Babel? Austrians, Czechs, Germans, Serbs, Croats, Italians, Poles, all marching together. None of them understanding what the hell anyone else was saying? This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was a systemic critical failure waiting to detonate. Joseph II himself had written to his brother Leopold about this exact problem. The diversity of our troops, though a strength in numbers, has proven to be a formidable challenge in command. The men, unable to understand one another, fall into disarray at the slightest provocation. Translation: Yo, our boys can't communicate, and they're one bad day away from total chaos. Did Joseph do anything about this? Did he establish standardized signals? Assign translators to every unit? Create a unified command language? Nope. He just marched them into hostile territory and hoped really hard that nothing would go wrong. This is a leadership equivalent of driving cross-country with your check engine light on, no spare tire, and a gas gauge that's been broken for 6 months, then acting shocked when you break down in the middle of nowhere. But wait, it gets worse. The different ethnic groups didn't just misunderstand each other. They straight up didn't trust each other. There were underlying ethnic tensions, rivalries, and old grudges simmering beneath the surface. Historians describe these as sources of mistrust and rivalry that exacerbated the rapid escalation of violence. So you got soldiers who can't talk to each other, don't trust each other, and are scared out of their minds that 70,000 Ottoman troops are about to roll up on them in the dark. What could go wrong? Red flag number 2. The command structure was a joke. The Austrian military bureaucracy was notoriously cumbersome, with multiple layers of authority often contradicting one another. Field officers and generals frequently lacked clear orders or issued conflicting directives. Soldiers did not always know who they were supposed to report to, and in moments of confusion, discipline broke down rapidly. So let me get this straight. You got an army where nobody knows who's in charge, orders contradict each other, and the chain of command is about as sturdy as a Jenga tower built by a toddler having a sugar crash. And they're about to face the Ottoman Empire. This is like showing up to a group project where nobody knows who the team leader is. Everyone has different instructions. Half the team didn't read the assignment, and the presentation is in 5 minutes. But sure, this will be fine. Red flag number 3. Everyone was already terrified. By September 1788, Austrian morale was in the toilet. They'd already botched the siege of Belgrade because Joseph randomly decided to retreat at the last second. They'd lost the Danube Valley. General after general had screwed up. The troops had lost faith in their officers, and officers grumbled about their emperor. Now they were camped at Carensiebes, knowing that Grand Vizier Koka Yusuf Pasha was marching toward them with 70,000 men. They'd heard stories about Ottoman warriors. They knew what happened to prisoners. Everyone was scared, exhausted, and on edge. The psychological state of the soldiers was primed for disaster. The psychological state of the soldiers, primed to expect an Ottoman attack, played a crucial role in the ensuing chaos. These boys were so jumpy that a cat knocking over a tin would have probably caused a stampede. They were operating in extreme psychological and logistical strain. And what did the Austrian command do to calm nerves, establish clear protocols, and prepare for a disciplined engagement? Jack squat. They just parked 100,000 terrified men in the dark near a river and hoped for the best. Red flag number 4. It's dark and nobody can see anything. September 21st, 1788. Night falls. The Austrian camp is plunged into total, frightening darkness. This is before electricity, before flashlights, before glow sticks, before literally any form of reliable nighttime illumination except torches and campfires. Visibility? 0. Ability to identify friend from foe? Also 0. Conditions for a catastrophic friendly fire incident? Chef's kiss. Historians describe the scene. Everything took place in total, frightening darkness. Soldiers couldn't see what was happening. Only hear the noise of battle, the moans of the wounded and the death cries, which help to intensify their terror. So you've got soldiers who can't talk to each other, don't trust each other, are scared out of their minds, operating under incompetent leadership, in pitch-black darkness, with no way to identify threats. This is fine. Everything is fine. Red flag number 5. Alcohol was readily available. Here's a fun military leadership tip. If your troops are already scared, confused, and primed for panic, maybe don't let them get hammered on schnapps while on active duty in hostile territory. But the Austrian command apparently didn't get that memo. The vanguard, a squadron of hussars, crossed the Timmy's River on the night of September 21st to scout for Ottoman forces. Their job was recon. Stay sharp. Watch for the enemy. Report back. Instead, they ran into a group of Romani locals who offered to sell them schnapps. And the hussars looked at this alcohol, looked at their military objectives, looked back at the schnapps and said, "You know what? Recon can wait. We're getting lit." They bought the booze and started drinking. Because nothing says elite military discipline like getting drunk on the job while the enemy is literally marching toward you. This is the equivalent of a security guard at a bank leaving their post mid-shift to hit up happy hour at the bar across the street. Except instead of getting fired, these guys were about to accidentally trigger the dumbest military disaster in European history. The moment everything went sideways. So the hussars are sitting there, getting progressively more drunk, probably telling exaggerated stories about battles they definitely didn't win, when an infantry unit shows up. The infantry guys see the schnapps and are like, "Hey, share the booze." And the hussars, drunk, possessive, and apparently having the decision-making skills of a raccoon defending a trash can, said no. Not just no, but hell no, this is our schnapps. Then, and I cannot stress enough how stupid this is, they built fortifications around the alcohol barrels. These cavalrymen, who were supposed to be scouting for the Ottoman army, instead constructed defensive positions to protect their booze from their own infantry. The infantry was understandably like, "What the hell, guys?" A heated argument broke out. Tensions escalated, and then someone fired a shot. The shot heard round the camp. That single gunshot was like pulling the pin on a grenade in a room full of paranoid, scared, multilingual soldiers who'd been told for weeks that the Ottomans were coming. It was the noise of the shot that had frightened the men, and once they recovered from the initial shock, they too began to shoot. Immediately, chaos erupted. Someone, we don't know who, but bless their panic-stricken heart, started screaming, "Tursi, Tursi, Turks, Turks." And that's when things went from bad bar fight to absolute apocalyptic nightmare. The hussars and infantry, hearing "Turks, Turks," immediately assumed an Ottoman attack was happening right now and panicked. They scattered. They fled back toward the main camp, screaming warnings in multiple languages that nobody could understand. Austrians yelling in German, Serbs yelling in Serbian, Croats yelling in Croatian, Italians yelling in Italian. It was a cacophony of terror, and nobody had any idea what the hell was happening. The worst game of telephone in history. Now, remember, the main Austrian camp was on the other side of the river. They'd been asleep. Suddenly, they were woken up by gunfire, screaming, and the sound of soldiers running through the darkness. And what did they think was happening? The vanguard had encountered the Turks. They couldn't imagine what else could have started the shooting and screaming. The entire camp assumed the Ottoman army had arrived and was already attacking. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers started shouting warnings and orders to retreat or defend themselves against an unseen enemy. But here's the kicker. Because nobody could understand each other, these warnings just added to the confusion. Some German officers, desperately trying to restore order, started yelling, "Halt! Halt! Stop! Stop!" And the non-German soldiers heard, "Halt!" and thought they were hearing, "Allah! Allah!" as in Ottoman war cries, which made them more convinced that the Turks were already in the camp. This is the military equivalent of a horror movie where the protagonists keep making everything worse by trying to help. Enter the artillery, because why not? Remember General of Artillery Colloredo? He woke up to chaos, saw a cavalryman running to the camp in the darkness, and thought, that must be an Ottoman cavalry charge. So he did what any artillery commander would do when faced with what he thought was an enemy attack. He ordered his cannons to open fire on his own troops. The night lit up with blue flashes and thunderclaps as artillery shells started raining down on an Austrian camp. More soldiers began to fall, and everyone started screaming, "The Turk! The Turk! Save yourself! All is lost." At this point, soldiers were shooting at anything that moved. Units, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the dark and smoke, inadvertently engaged each other. The entire army was fighting itself. Meanwhile, there wasn't a single Ottoman soldier within miles of the camp. The emperor takes a swim. Emperor Joseph II, to his credit, actually tried to stop the madness. He rode out personally, trying to rally his troops and restore order. But his soldiers were so terrified and crazed with panic that they couldn't be reasoned with. One of his aides stood firmly in front of him, striking out at the fear-crazed soldiers. He felled a few with his saber before he was trampled to the ground and his breath crushed from his body. And then, in what might be the single most humiliating moment of Joseph's already embarrassing military career, he got knocked off his horse and fell into the river. The Holy Roman Emperor, soaking wet, crawled out of the Timmy's River and hid in a house in Carenseebes until his personal guards could rescue him. His brother, Archduke Franz, nearly suffered the same fate and had to be rescued by his regiment. This is the guy who was supposed to be leading Austria to victory against the Ottomans. He couldn't even lead his own troops without getting thrown in a river by them. The stampede. Oh, but wait, there's more. In the middle of the camp was a fenced-off area with cart horses. These horses, terrified by the gunfire, screaming and artillery explosions, knocked down the fence and stampeded. The sound of hundreds of panicked horses thundering through the darkness sounded like advancing cavalry, which made Colloredo and other commanders think the Ottoman cavalry had broken through the lines. So they ordered more artillery fire at the horses, which were their own horses. At this point, the Austrian army was shooting at 1, itself 2, shadows 3, its own horses, and 4, literally anything that made noise. The Ottomans, meanwhile, were still 2 days away, probably enjoying a nice dinner and having absolutely no idea that the Austrians were doing their job for them. The retreat from nobody. By dawn, the Austrian army had completely routed. They'd fled from an enemy that didn't exist. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of soldiers were dead or wounded. Emperor Joseph II, soaking wet and utterly demoralized, ordered a full retreat. The panic caused by the incident demoralized the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II to the point that he ordered the army to withdraw. They abandoned Carenseebes entirely. And 2 days later, on September 23rd, Grand Vizier Koka Yusuf Pasha and the Ottoman army finally arrived. They found dead and wounded soldiers everywhere and easily took Carenseebes. The Ottomans didn't fire a single shot. They just walked in, looked around at the carnage, and were probably like, "Did we miss something?" The Austrian army had just achieved the impossible. They'd lost the battle to themselves. And the aftermath? Oh, that's where it gets really good. Let's set the scene. It's the night of September 21st to 22nd, 1788. Pitch black. 100,000 Austrian soldiers camped near Carenseebes. The Ottoman army is supposedly 2 days away. Everyone's on edge. And some drunk hussars just fire a shot during an argument over Schnapps. This is the moment. This is where everything goes from bad situation to certified historical catastrophe. What happens next is what historians would later call history's worst friendly fire incident. And buckle up, because it's spectacular. The domino effect of death. That single gunshot echoed across the Thames River like the starting pistol for the world's dumbest race. Immediately, the hussars and infantry at the river, already drunk, already arguing, panicked. Someone screamed, "Tursi! Tursi! Turks! Turks!" And it was like someone had yelled fire in a crowded theater, except the theater was full of armed soldiers who couldn't understand each other and were already scared out of their minds. The psychological state of these troops was primed to expect an Ottoman attack. They'd been told for weeks that 70,000 Ottoman warriors were coming. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen what happened in previous battles. They were operating under extreme psychological and logistical strain. So when someone yelled, "Turks!" nobody stopped to verify. They just ran. Hussars scattered. Infantry fled back toward the main camp, screaming warnings in German, Serbian, Croatian, Italian. A Tower of Babel made of pure terror. Austrian, Serbs, Croats, and Italians shouted in their languages, creating a chaotic scene. And here's where the linguistic nightmare became a death sentence. Halt becomes Allah. German officers, seeing their men flee in panic, desperately tried to restore order. They stood in the darkness and shouted at the top of their lungs, "Halt! Halt! Stop! Stop!" It was a reasonable command, a sensible attempt at leadership. But the non-German soldiers, Serbs, Croats, Italians, Czechs, heard halt in the darkness, and their brains, already running on pure fear-driven adrenaline, made a terrifying connection. Allah, Allah, Ottoman war cries. The Turks were already in the camp. The soldiers interpreted halt as Allah, Allah. This is the military equivalent of playing telephone while everyone's drunk, scared, and shooting at each other. Except instead of "I like turtles" turning into "eyelid hurdles," "stop running," turned into "Muslim warriors are murdering U.S. right now." The panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers who'd been sleeping in their tents woke up to gunfire, screaming, and what they thought were Ottoman battle cries. They grabbed their weapons and started firing at anything that moved. And remember, it's pitch black. Everything took place in total, frightening darkness. Visibility? 0. Ability to tell friend from foe? Also 0. Units, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the dark and smoke, inadvertently engage each other. This was friendly fire on an industrial scale. The artillery commander's brilliant decision. Let's talk about General of Artillery Colloredo. Colloredo woke up to chaos, gunfire, screaming, and through the darkness, he saw a cavalryman running through the camp. Now, a competent commander might have thought, "Wait, those look like our hussars. Maybe I should figure out what's happening before I start blasting." Colloredo looked at the situation and thought, "Ottoman cavalry charge. Time to light 'em up." The cavalrymen running through the camps were mistaken for Ottoman cavalry by the artillery commander, Colloredo, who ordered fire. He ordered his artillery batteries to open fire on his own soldiers. Cannons roared. The night exploded with blue flashes and thunderclaps. Artillery shells arced through the darkness and crashed down into the Austrian camp, on Austrian soldiers. More soldiers began to fall. And if you're thinking, surely someone realized they were shooting their own guys, let me stop you right there. The cannon fire just made everything worse. Because now soldiers throughout the camp heard explosions, saw flashes, felt the ground shake, and thought, "Oh, God, the Ottomans have artillery. We're surrounded. We're done." People started screaming, the Turk, save yourself. All is lost." Panic turned into full-blown hysteria. The camp becomes a war zone against itself. What followed was a catastrophe of epic proportions. Meanwhile, throughout the camp, panicked soldiers fled or shot at each other. Soldiers were firing wildly into the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit up confused faces. The smoke from black powder weapons turned the air thick and choking. The dense smoke, shouting, and sporadic gunfire created a terrifying atmosphere where rational command was impossible. Men were taking permanent naps left and right. Hundreds of soldiers were injured or sent to the Shadow Realm before the commanders could regain control. And here's the darkest irony. The common soldiers weren't incompetent. They weren't cowards. They were scared men following their training in a situation that made absolutely no sense. They heard gunfire, so they returned fire. They heard artillery, so they took cover. They heard screaming about Turks, so they fought what they thought were Turks. The problem? There were no Turks. Every single person they were shooting at was Austrian. The entire army retreated from the imaginary enemy. This wasn't soldiers being dumb. This was leadership failing so catastrophically that it created a self-fulfilling prophecy of disaster. The horse stampede, because why not? Just when you think it can't get any dumber, it gets dumber. In the middle of the camp was a fence enclosure containing hundreds of cart horses. These horses had been relatively calm until the shooting started. Then the artillery opened up. Then soldiers started screaming and running everywhere. The horses, understandably, freaked out. They knocked down the fence and stampeded through the camp. And here's where Austrian military intelligence really shines. The sound of hundreds of panicked horses thundering through the darkness sounded like advancing cavalry to the Austrian commanders. So they thought the Ottoman cavalry had broken through their lines. Colloredo and other officers ordered more artillery fire at the horses, their own horses. At this point, the Austrian army was actively unaliving. Number 1, infantry mistaken for enemy infantry. Number 2, cavalry mistaken for enemy cavalry. Number 3, horses mistaken for enemy horses, apparently. Number 4, each other mistaken for literally anything. Number 5, shadows mistaken for Ottomans. The elite Habsburg army, centuries of military tradition, the pride of the Holy Roman Empire, was getting absolutely wrecked by nobody. The fear of an Ottoman ambush led to a full-blown rout. Except there was no ambush. There was just Schnapps, darkness, and the worst leadership in European military history. The Emperor Splash. Emperor Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, enlightened despot, and apparently the only person in the entire camp trying to restore sanity, rode out personally to stop the chaos. He tried to rally his troops. He shouted orders. He attempted to be the strong leader his army needed, and his soldiers were so terrified and out of their minds with panic that they couldn't be reasoned with. One of Joseph's aides stood firmly in front of him, striking out at the fear-crazed soldiers. He felled a few with his saber before he was trampled to the ground and his breath crushed from his body. The aide was literally crushed to death trying to protect the emperor from his own army. And then, in what might be the single most humiliating moment in the history of Habsburg military leadership, Emperor Joseph II got knocked off his horse and fell into the Timmy's River. Emperor Joseph II, who was personally present during the campaign, fell off his horse into a stream in the panic. The Holy Roman Emperor, soaking wet, crawling out of a river, while his army fought itself. He had to hide in a house in Karansebes until his personal guards could rescue him. This is the same guy who'd stood at this exact spot and declared, "Here we have to win. History has planned it this way." It was here that Prince Eugene achieved a brilliant victory over the Turks, and this is the best place to beat them again. Prince Eugene would have been so proud. His brother, Archduke Franz, nearly got trampled too and had to be rescued by his regiment. The leadership of the Austrian army, the commanders who were supposed to coordinate 100,000 men against the Ottoman Empire, couldn't even survive their own troops. The realization, or lack thereof. Here's the thing. There was no single realization moment where some commander stood up and yelled, "Wait, guys, we're shooting ourselves." Because rational command was impossible. The chaos was so complete, so total, that nobody could piece together what was actually happening. The noise of battle, the moans of the wounded, and the death cries helped to intensify their terror. Officers were trying to restore order, but their orders were drowned out by gunfire, screams, and artillery. The realization came slowly as dawn broke and surviving soldiers could finally see. And what they saw was a nightmare. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of their own men lying in the camp, not from Ottoman bullets, not from glorious combat, from each other. The initial skirmish over Schnapps thus mutated into a tragic friendly fire incident. The elite Habsburg army, with its centuries-old reputation for discipline and battlefield prowess, had collapsed without ever facing the enemy. Historians would later write, how could the once formidable Habsburg army collapse so spectacularly without ever facing the enemy? The answer? Incompetent leadership, terrible communication, and Schnapps. That's it. That's the answer. The body count nobody wants to talk about. So how bad was it? Historians debate the exact numbers because, shocker, the Austrian military wasn't exactly eager to document this disaster in detail. Conservative estimates put the casualties at around 200. More generous or honest, accounts say 2,000 dead and wounded. One historian, Paul Bernard, claimed 10,000 casualties. That number's been disputed. But even if it's half that, even if it's a quarter of that, we're talking about thousands of Austrian soldiers sent to the Shadow Realm by their own army, over Schnapps. History's worst friendly fire incident doesn't even begin to cover how embarrassing this is. The Ottoman victory lap. By dawn on September 22nd, the Austrian army was in full retreat. The panic caused by the incident demoralized the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, to the point that he ordered the army to withdraw. They abandoned Karansebes entirely. They left their wounded behind. They fled from an enemy that still hadn't arrived. 2 days later, on September 23rd, Grand Vizier Koka Yusuf Pasha and the Ottoman army finally showed up. They walked up to Karansebes, expecting a battle. Instead, they found around 200 to 2,000 dead and wounded Austrian soldiers lying everywhere. The town was empty. The Ottomans were bewildered. They easily captured Karansebes. When the Turks did arrive 2 days later, they took Karansebes with little resistance. They didn't fire a shot. They just walked in. The Ottoman commanders probably stood there looking at the carnage thinking, did we miss the party? What the hell happened here? Imagine being the Ottoman army. You march for days expecting a massive battle against 100,000 Austrians. You're psyching yourself up. You're prepared for heavy casualties. You're ready for siege warfare. And you arrive to find out the Austrians already did your job for you. This is the easiest military victory in Ottoman history. They literally didn't do anything. The Austrians just self-destructed. The Battle of Karansebes wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete systemic failure, a case study in how not to command an army. For the military aristocracy, the Battle of Karansebes was a stark indictment of leadership failure and a glaring symptom of deeper structural problems. But the real question is, what happened next? How did Austria try to spin this? What were the consequences? Oh, buddy, the aftermath is where it gets really interesting. So, the sun rises on September 22nd, 1788, over Karansebes. The smoke clears, the gunfire stops, and the surviving Austrian soldiers finally get to see what they've accomplished. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. The morning after the world's dumbest battle. When the morning light finally revealed the devastating scope of the disaster, commanders were confronted with a grim tableau. Hundreds of soldiers dead or wounded, not by enemy fire, but by the chaotic volley of friendly muskets and cannon fire. The scene was one of utter disarray. With fragmented units scattered across the surrounding forests and fields, many still dazed from the night's pandemonium. Equipment was abandoned everywhere. Tents were trampled. Weapons were scattered across the ground. And hundreds, possibly thousands, of soldiers were lying there, casualties of the most embarrassing military disaster in modern history. The casualty count? Well, that depends on who you ask. Conservative estimates say 150 to 200. More realistic accounts put it at 2,000 dead and wounded. Some sources claim 10,000. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but even the low estimates are catastrophic when you consider there was no enemy present. The Austrian army had just inflicted hundreds of casualties on itself over Schnapps. Emperor Joseph II, soaking wet from his impromptu swim in the Timmy's River, looked at the carnage and made the only decision that made sense: retreat. The panic caused by the incident demoralized the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, to the point that he ordered the army to withdraw. They abandoned Karansebes. They left their dead and wounded behind. They fled from an enemy that still hadn't shown up. The mighty Habsburg army, 100,000 strong, beaten by their own incompetence. The Ottomans walking like, thanks. 2 days later, On September 23rd, the Ottoman army under Grand Vizier Koka Yusuf Pasha finally arrived at Karansibes. They were expecting a battle. They were psyched for combat. They were ready for siege warfare, artillery duels, and the whole 9 yards. Instead, they found dead and wounded soldiers everywhere. The town was completely abandoned. 2 days later, the Ottoman army arrived, bewildered to see around 200 to 2,000 dead and wounded, according to each source, and easily captured Karansibes. They easily took Karansibes, without firing a single shot. The Ottoman commanders stood there, looked at the carnage, looked at each other, and probably said something like, "So, did we win?" "I think we won." "Yeah, we definitely won." This went down in Ottoman records as the easiest victory in Ottoman history. And honestly, they're not wrong. The Austrians literally defeated themselves and gifted the Ottomans a strategic town. It's the military equivalent of your opponent rage quitting before the game even starts, and the win counting on your record. The cover-up begins. So, how did Austria handle this catastrophic embarrassment? Did they court-martial the incompetent commanders? Launch a full investigation? Implement sweeping reforms to prevent this from ever happening again? Sort of. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Karansibes was marked by confusion, shame, and a palpable sense of disbelief among the Austrian military leadership. The news traveled fast up the chain of command and beyond, ultimately reaching the ears of the emperor and government officials in Vienna. The embarrassment was profound. Because here's the thing. How do you explain to the emperor and the entire Habsburg bureaucracy that your army just lost thousands of men to itself? How do you spin that? Investigations followed, though their results were mixed and often inconclusive. Translation. They investigated, found a whole bunch of people responsible, and then quietly decided that holding everyone accountable would make the entire command structure look bad. Many officers were officially reprimanded, and some were quietly reassigned away from frontline command. Notice the word quietly. They didn't want a big public scandal. They didn't want to admit that their multi-ethnic army was a communications nightmare held together with duct tape and prayers. So they slapped some wrists, moved some people around, and hoped everyone would forget about it. However, the systemic causes, linguistic confusion, ethnic rivalries, poor communication channels, and ineffective leadership, remained stubbornly unaddressed. In other words, they learned nothing. They didn't fix the language barriers. They didn't address the ethnic tensions. They didn't improve communication protocols. They didn't replace the incompetent commanders with competent ones. This failure to learn the full scope of lessons from Karansibes would haunt the Austrian army for years to come. Spoiler alert, it did. Who got fired? Nobody important. Here's the beautiful irony. The people who deserved to get fired mostly didn't. General of Artillery Colloredo, the genius who ordered artillery fire on his own cavalry, was officially reprimanded, which in Habsburg bureaucracy means he got a strongly worded letter and then went about his business. The other incompetent commanders Joseph had appointed, most of them were quietly reassigned. Not fired, not court-martialed, reassigned. It's like when a bad teacher gets moved to a different school instead of getting fired. The problem doesn't go away. It just becomes someone else's problem. Emperor Joseph II himself? Well, this incident likely contributed to his declining health and eventual death in 1790. The dude was so embarrassed and stressed out by the disaster that historians think it literally shortened his life. He'd spent his entire reign trying to prove he was a great military leader, and instead he ended up soaking wet in a river while his army self-destructed around him. That's not the legacy you want engraved on your tomb. The long-term damage. But the real consequences weren't just about who got fired or reassigned. The damage ran much deeper. One of the most profound consequences of the incident was a severe blow dealt to troop morale. Soldiers who survived the chaotic night were not only physically wounded, but also psychologically scarred. The trauma of having fired upon comrades, of being both victim and perpetrator in the same tragic event, left deep emotional wounds. These soldiers developed what we now recognize as PTSD. Reports from military hospitals describe soldiers haunted by guilt and fear, some developing symptoms akin to what modern psychology would identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. They'd shot their own friends in the darkness. They'd killed men they'd marched with, eaten with, fought alongside, and they had to live with that for the rest of their lives. Trust within units, already fragile due to ethnic tensions, fractured further. Soldiers became wary of their fellow regiments, and cohesion suffered, undermining the Army's ability to fight effectively in the subsequent campaigns. The Austrian army was broken, not physically, though they lost thousands of men, but psychologically. Nobody trusted each other anymore. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Strategically, the Austrian command had to contend with the tangible weakening of their forces. The loss of manpower and the disruption to unit organization impaired their operational readiness. The self-inflicted damage at Karansebes likely contributed to a string of Austrian setbacks during the 1788 campaign season. The war dragged on for 3 more years, and Austria never really recovered from Karansebes. They'd shot themselves in the foot, literally and metaphorically, and it cost them dearly. The historical verdict. Historically, the Battle of Karansebes also serves as an allegory for the broader decline of the Habsburg Empire's military effectiveness in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The incident revealed the weaknesses of an imperial system struggling to integrate diverse peoples under a single command. It foreshadowed future challenges the empire would face in nationalism and internal cohesion, which eventually contributed to its dissolution in the 20th century. Karansebes wasn't just a one-time screw-up. It was a symptom of a dying empire. The Habsburgs had built this massive multi-ethnic empire, but they never figured out how to actually unite all those different peoples. They just threw everyone together, gave them weapons, and hoped it would work out. Spoiler, it didn't. And Karansebes was the moment where all those systemic failures came home to roost. The historians roast why this was the stupidest moment in military history. All right, let's talk about why the Battle of Karansebes deserves its place as possibly the dumbest military disaster in recorded history. First, the Austrians had 100,000 men, artillery, cavalry, supply lines, and every possible military advantage. And they managed to lose hundreds, possibly thousands, of soldiers without the enemy even showing up. That's not just incompetence. That's a masterclass in incompetence. Second, the entire disaster was triggered by drunk soldiers fighting over Schnapps. Not strategic objectives. Not territorial control. Booze. These hussars literally built fortifications around alcohol barrels to defend them from their own infantry. If that doesn't summarize the idiocy of this entire event, I don't know what does. Third, the language barrier problem wasn't some surprise. Emperor Joseph II knew his multi-ethnic army couldn't communicate. He'd literally written letters complaining about it, and he did nothing to fix it. That's like driving with your check engine light on for 6 months, and then acting shocked when your engine explodes. Fourth, the halt becoming a moment is peak stupidity. German officers trying to restore order accidentally convinced everyone that the Ottomans were already in the camp. This is the military equivalent of yelling "don't panic," and causing everyone to panic. Fifth, General Colloredo ordering artillery fire on his own cavalry is just chef's kiss. I see horsemen running through the darkness. Better assume they're enemies and start blasting. No reconnaissance. No verification. Just pure, unfiltered panic. 6. Emperor Joseph II, the guy who picked all these incompetent commanders, ended up so. Here's a complete finalized ending of the script. 6. Emperor Joseph II, the guy who picked all these incompetent commanders, ended up soaking wet in a river while his army destroyed itself. The Holy Roman Emperor, symbol of Habsburg power and prestige, crawling out of the Timmy's River like a drowned rat. You cannot write comedy better than that. 7th, the Ottomans showed up 2 days later, saw the carnage, and just walked in. They got credit for a military victory they didn't earn. The Austrians literally gift-wrapped a strategic town and handed it to the enemy. Finally, Austria learned nothing from this. They investigated, found all the problems, and then decided fixing them was too hard. So they just shuffled some people around and hoped for the best. And then they wondered why their military continued to struggle for decades. This wasn't just a battle gone wrong. This was a complete systemic failure at every level of command. leadership, logistics, communication, discipline. Everything failed simultaneously. And the kicker? It was entirely preventable. The lesson that Austria ignored. The Battle of Karansebes became a cautionary tale about the importance of clear communication and discipline within military forces. It also highlighted the challenges of managing a multi-ethnic army with diverse languages and cultures. Here's what Austria should have learned. Number 1, fix your communication problems. If your troops can't understand each other, bad things will happen. Number 2, don't promote incompetent people. Just because someone's from a noble family doesn't mean they should command an army. Number 3, address ethnic tensions. Ignoring them won't make them go away. Number 4, don't let your troops get drunk on duty. This should be obvious, but apparently it wasn't. Number 5, train for nighttime operations. If your soldiers panic in the dark, maybe drill them so they don't. Did Austria implement any of these lessons? Nope. And they paid for it over the next century as their empire slowly collapsed. The final word. The Battle of Karansebes stands as a monument to everything that can go wrong when incompetent leadership meets terrible communication, ethnic tensions, alcohol, and darkness. It's the story of an empire in decline that was too proud to admit its problems and too stubborn to fix them. It's a reminder that wars aren't won by fancy uniforms and impressive titles. They're won by competent leaders, clear communication, and soldiers who trust each other. And most importantly, it's a reminder that if you let your cavalry get drunk and build fortifications around Schnapps barrels, you're going to have a bad time. The Austrians went into Karansebes with 100,000 men and came out with hundreds of casualties, shattered morale, and the most embarrassing military defeat in European history. All because nobody wanted to address the obvious problems. All because leadership failed at every level. All because of Schnapps. So what can you learn from this? Don't ignore red flags. Don't put incompetent people in charge. Don't assume everything will work out if you just hope really hard. And for the love of God, make sure your team can actually communicate with each other. Whether you're running a business, managing a project, or leading a military campaign, the lessons of Karansebes apply. Bad leadership kills. Poor communication destroys. Ignoring systemic problems doesn't make them go away. It makes them explode at the worst possible moment. The Battle of Karansebes isn't just a funny story about drunk soldiers shooting each other. It's a case study in organizational failure. It's what happens when ego, incompetence, and systemic dysfunction collide. And if you enjoyed learning about history's most embarrassing military disaster, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, there are plenty more stories of military incompetence where this came from. And if you don't subscribe, you might end up making the same mistakes. Don't be like Emperor Joseph II, soaking wet in a river while everything burns around you. Learn from history. Subscribe. And maybe lay off the schnapps. Because the only thing worse than being defeated by your enemy is being defeated by yourself. And that's exactly what happened at Karansebes on the night of September 21st, 1788, when 100,000 Austrian soldiers proved that sometimes your worst enemy is staring back at you in the mirror. Or, in this case, shooting at you from the darkness while you shoot back, neither of you realizing you're on the same side. History is full of military blunders, tactical disasters, and strategic catastrophes. But the Battle of Karansebes? That's in a league of its own. It's the gold standard of military stupidity, the benchmark by which all other friendly fire incidents are measured, and a permanent reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall, not to their enemies, but to their own incompetence. So the next time you think your day is going badly, just remember, at least you didn't accidentally start a battle against yourself over alcohol and end up losing thousands of your own men to friendly fire while the enemy was still 2 days away. That's the Austrian army's legacy, and that's the Battle of Karansebes. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that no matter how bad their leadership is, it could always be worse. It could be Emperor Joseph II levels of bad. And trust me, you don't want that.